Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Submarine Dreams, Understanding Australia's Commitment to Aukus. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Emma Shortis. I'm the Director of International and Security Affairs here at the Australia Institute. And today I am coming to you from the unceded lands of the Kirrae-Wurrung people in southwest Victorian Sea Country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Before I introduce our guests, I just wanted to give you a few Zoom tips. We encourage you to take part in the conversation via the chat box, and you can also type questions for our panel using the little Q&A box down the bottom, and you can upvote other people's questions as well. Please do keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you from the conversation. And finally, this is a live event and it's being recorded. The video will be up and available soon on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. But now let's get stuck in. The news out of the United States is pretty grim and it keeps getting grimmer. We saw, I think, last week what may well be a watershed moment for American democracy when the Secretary of Defense, Peter Hegseth, and the President of the United States, Donald Trump, stood up in front of 800 or so members of the top brass of the US military and effectively told them that members of the Defense Force could retaliate without consequences, that they could use cities like Chicago or Portland or Los Angeles as training grounds, and that they were effectively unconstrained by morality and would become, or could become, effectively an instrument of the Oval Office. I was reading in the Atlantic's daily newsletter today, Tom Nichols, who's not exactly a radical, wrote that soon top US military commanders may have to decide whether they will refuse such orders, illegal orders, from the commander-in-chief. The greatest crisis of American civil-military relations in modern history is now underway. So this is how serious things are. And of course, this has potentially severe consequences for American democracy, but it has very real consequences for the rest of the world too, as none of this is confined to the domestic United States. All of this is being projected outwards as the Trump administration deliberately dismantles the international rule of law and institutions of global governance. And the question then becomes, of course, what does this mean for the rest of the world? What does it mean in particular for traditional allies of the United States like Australia? What does it mean if the American military becomes an instrument of the White House, unconstrained by morality or democratic accountability? And why is it that the Australian government seems to be doubling down on the alliance? And how has the alliance, given all that is unfolding in the United States, given that the world order is being remade as we watch, how is it that the alliance has become so focused only on submarines? And this, despite increasing evidence that the Aukus nuclear-powered submarine pact is destined to fall over. And yet the Australian Labor government appears to remain pretty committed to this deal. And that's in the face, I think, of rising community concern. You know, polling by the Australia Institute indicates that the Australian community is not convinced. 54% of Australians now say they want a more independent foreign policy. And nearly 57% support or strongly support a parliamentary inquiry into the Aukus submarine deal. So where to now? Where do we go with all of this? Joining me today to discuss these questions and more are, as you can see on the screen, the Honourable Doug Cameron, the former Senator from New South Wales from 2007 to 2019, representing the Australian Labor Party. Doug served as Parliamentary Secretary for Housing and Homelessness in the second Rudd government, and then was Opposition Shadow Minister across the portfolios of Human Services, Skills, TAFE and Apprenticeships, and Housing and Homelessness. Doug retired from Parliament in 2019, but has stayed very active in Australian public life, championing progressive causes, including housing policy reform and the need for foreign policy independence. Arthur Rorris, who is joining us from Crete to explain the darkness there very kindly, all the way from Crete, is the Secretary of the New South Wales South Coast Trades and Labour Council, which is a peak union body representing 25 affiliated unions from the Illawarra all the way to the Victorian border in the south. And in his role as secretary, he has been a leading campaigner for green jobs, for climate action, for a nuclear-free future, and the Labor movement against Aukus. Okay, so with all that, let's get stuck in. Doug, I thought I'd begin with you. We've heard news in the last couple of weeks that AUKUS will likely survive the Trump review, although it has gone on a lot longer than promised, and that will likely be formally announced around the time of that much anticipated meeting between Prime Minister Albanese and President Trump. What do you make of it all? Were you surprised by this review?
No, absolutely not. I took the view that when you've got a mug, hold on to them. And Australia has just signed agreements that are terrible. They destroy our sovereignty. They make us nothing more than, a part of the US global position. Uh, I never had any doubt that AUKUS would be cancelled. Uh, I just thought it was too good a deal for the US to walk away from this.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And you mentioned there, Doug, the question of sovereignty. Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, has argued a number of times, I think, that AUKUS actually enhances Australian sovereignty. But I'm guessing from your comments there that that's not how you see it. What do you think? What impact do you think that AUKUS does have on Australian sovereignty?
Well, it destroys our sovereignty. We have allowed the biggest military power in the world to set up a base or a number of bases in Australia. We had a long, proud tradition of opposing nuclear arms. We will now have nuclear submarines that are US with nuclear arms on board. We will have, B-52 bombers, strike bombers capable of striking against China on our shores with nuclear arms. So how can this enhance our sovereignty? It's the most bizarre argument I've ever heard from any politician for a long time. You just cannot keep denying reality. A bad deal that we've signed, we lose our sovereignty, and we become nothing more than an appendage of US militarism.
Mm. Um, Arthur, I think, the polling I mentioned earlier suggests that the community is um, at odds somewhat with the government position on this. That community concern mirrors the concerns that Doug just outlined. You've been working on the ground in your community a lot around AUKUS in particular. Is that what you're seeing in your community, a level of concern about this?
Well, very much so. I mean, this isn't. This is a campaign in which the union movement's playing a very big and leading role. But only recently there was a declaration from Port Kembla, from our key port in our area, signed by 41 community organisations, that it was instigated by those community organisations. It's showing that the people, again, are ahead of the government when it comes to those very real concerns. And
Mm.
those concerns extend across a range of areas. I mean, this is, in many ways, people see this as something that is unlikely to happen in the way that the governments project it to happen, but believe that it's even worse if it works. This is one of those
Mm.
few things where it's unlikely to ever work, but it'll actually be worse if it does. So it puts us into a no-win situation, but it focuses the mind of the community on what happens on the ground. We hear the big picture strategic arguments about China and other things. The purpose has never been clear. It's more creep than mission, as we say, when you look at people like Trump and others. And people ask the question, well, what is it all for? What will it mean
Mm.
for my community? Is it as bad as just becoming nuclear targets? Is there more to it? Will we have access to our own land? Because we see what happens in other areas. The one big thing now, I guess, is the thing that's really hit home is the events in the US, because people can see through this. Behind every government suggestion of, well, we play the long game, not just administration by administration, implying that Trump will go and then we'll return to normality. I think now, for the first time, people are starting to have real doubts as to what the real normal is, whether it has changed forever, and what happens if we're basically put into a compromised position during a Trump administration, given that he's now not even talking about defence, he's talking about offence. He's even renamed his department the Department of War. What does that mean for his strategic partners? And at the end of the day, the ultimate thing, I think the killer, really, for, pardon the pun, for our community was seeing what's happening in Europe with the Ukraine. And people are asking themselves the question, if he's not really going to lift a finger for Europe, what's he going to do for Australia or Port Kembla? You know, so people feel as if these decisions are made in secrecy, without explanation, and without any realistic, no real attempt to actually explain what the purpose of this is.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Arthur. You know, the point about how these decisions are made and seem to be above any kind of democratic scrutiny or accountability. Doug, of course, you spent a lot of time in Parliament and in the Labor Party. Despite this opposition that Arthur has outlined and this call for, or this growing community concern, there's still no real sign that there'll be any genuine parliamentary oversight of the deal. Do you think that is possible, and do you think Parliament should play a role?
Well, of course, Parliament should play a role. I am extremely disappointed by many of my former colleagues in the Labour Party who seem to have been mute in relation to the serious implications that Aukus and this forced posture agreement has on Australia into the future. It seems to me that short-termism dominated the decision to do this. It was a short-term decision that AUKUS could not be opposed because it meant there would be another problem for Labour during an election campaign. So it was abandoned. I don't think any of my former colleagues have actually discussed the issue you raised about being constrained by morality. The US never seems to have been constrained by morality. If you look at what they've done over many, many years in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in their own backyards against Cuba, I mean, there's no morality in the US when it comes to their strategic position. They will seek to dominate, and that's it, full stop. And we are naive to think that we can get away with signing up to this and there'd be no implications. So the Labour caucus I indicated had been defanged and incorporated into the US militarism. And it's terrible what's happened. We will need to campaign for a long time and well into the future to change this. Remember, it took about 6 years before the Vietnam War became a public issue. And surely we can raise this with the public into the future and organize a peace campaign across the country to oppose tying ourselves to an aggressive militarism from the US.
Arthur, I mean, it's just following on from what Doug said, the last time we saw each other actually was at the Victorian State Labor Conference, where rank and file members there had mounted a really organised campaign to get a motion up that called for the suspension of Aukus and for a parliamentary inquiry, which actually passed with, I think it's safe to say, a resounding majority, despite significant attempts to stop that from happening. Do you think that that growing opposition from the union movement and from rank and file members of the Labor Party will be able to force change at the top in the caucus?
Well, that remains to be seen, but I do note this, and like Doug, I appreciate that in some ways it's early days, but I guess from another perspective, though, the context in which this debate is happening, you can't ignore. We can't ignore the international events at the moment and what is happening in terms of the threats to universalism, to the United Nations, to any kind of international mandate and respect for sovereignty of various countries. So that in some ways has brought it on a lot earlier in some ways than Vietnam. And what we've seen on the streets has been a lot bigger in response to that and a lot quicker. I think it'll take both angles, both the internal work within the ALP, and as people know, I mean, I'm an active member separate to my role as Secretary of the Labor Council in Labour Against War, as is Doug, who's a patron of the organisation, and branch after branch after branch is passing these resolutions. Once again, it's pretty clear, I think, where the membership is. But I don't think that alone will change it. I think it needs that broader movement to be saying to the Labor Party that whilst the party faithful will keep supporting the party to try to change things from within, others may lose patience. And this is one of those issues that's up there. The Conservatives have immigration. That's their big thing. They think that's going to win everything. And certainly there's been a surge to the right internationally, as we know, on those really base, ultra-right-wing sort of hot issues. For the rest of the population, it's pretty clear that the sovereignty of our own country is a biggie. There's no doubt. It's a big one. And when we consider now, I mean, let's just take one of the things in terms of how this projects and the optics. We now have the defence minister of this country in lockstep with the Prime Minister and others trying to convince the Trump administration that by agreeing to continue with Aukus and accept our money, that it's actually in their interest because they will have 100% control of those assets, whilst telling the Australian people, no, our sovereignty is intact. Anything with an Australian flag will have an Australian captain and will be subject to Australian command. Well, you can't dance on both sides of that street. You can't be saying to the Americans, do this, stick with us because they're going to be yours anyway. And to the Australians, no, this is all for Australia and Australia's defence. That is the fault line that now I think is so wide and will get wider as we get closer to these things.
And I mean, I think for what it's worth, Arthur, the difference was that in the past you might have been able to walk that line, but one of the many things that Trump does is say the quiet part out loud. You know, he will point that out, and you know, managing that, of course, is one of the extreme difficulties facing the alliance now. To zoom out a little bit, Doug, you know, I mentioned that meeting between the Prime Minister and President Trump that will happen in the next couple of weeks. How do you think that it is possible for the Prime Minister to manage that meeting? You know, is there an argument for the Prime Minister kind of making nice with Trump in order to try and insulate Australia from the, you know, I guess his worst instincts?
Well, no one in the US has been able to do that. No one in the Republican Party has been able to do that. No international leader has been able to do that. But I think just to focus on Trump and think that everything will be better when Trump disappears is naive. I think there's been a fundamental change in the US. The Democratic Party is nothing like it used to be in terms of representing working people. So the Democratic Party has done some terrible things in international relations over the years. And when Trump goes, I'm sure there will be more right-wing influencers trying to push this approach where everything focuses on America's capacity to be a hegemony and dominate both economically and militarily across the world. So Albo's got, I think, mission impossible trying to deal with this. And I think the outcome of that meeting will be that there will be more demands from Trump on Australia to increase defense spending, to guarantee that we will take part in a conflict with Taiwan, a conflict over Taiwan with China, our biggest trading partner. And that is a madness. You see, the US are a declining hegemony. China is a growing economy. And if you look at the expenditure, the US is expending, I think, $900 billion last year on military expenditure. China, 300 billion. These are huge amounts of money, but the US is still massively outspending China. I don't see China, frankly, as being, this hegemony, a worldwide hegemony into the future. They've got enough problems domestically, enough issues to try and continue increasing their economic and social position within China than to be out there attacking, other countries in East Asia or elsewhere. It just doesn't make sense to me what's happening. And while we've got 2 million people in Australia, which we were told last week couldn't put a meal on the table, we've got huge problems here. And rather than spending 368 billions at least on nuclear powered submarines, surely we should be building housing. Surely we should be, doing the things that Labour Party should be doing, looking after the disadvantaged, looking after the poor, having a better social welfare system, making sure that we do the right thing by the people that can't help themselves. And we're going to spend all this money on nuclear armed submarines. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and money on nuclear-powered submarines that we don't have no guarantee will actually arrive.
Well, that's right. And secondhand, if you signed an agreement to buy any domestic good and said, look, we'll sign up and we'll start paying it, but you don't have to deliver it. Within 12 months, you can say, I'm not going to deliver this, and we've got no comeback. But we will support, the military industrial complex in the UK, the military industrial complex in the USA. We will create jobs there, but we've got no guarantee that we'll get these nuclear-powered submarines. Why do we need nuclear-powered submarines? Labour politicians need to start being truthful. It's about attacking aggressively China, and that is not in our interests. Absolutely not.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's so much in there to unpack, and I'll just remind listeners that you can pop questions in the Q&A box. I can see there are quite a few there. Just on that question of manufacturing capacity and jobs that Doug brought up, Arthur, I think part of the Labor government's effort to grow commitment, I suppose, for Aukus has almost been to attempt to retrofit an industrial policy onto what was effectively a Morrison government political stunt. and with that has come the promise of, increased manufacturing capacity and lots of jobs in that manufacturing, in manufacturing submarines. What do you make of those industrial promises, whether they will be forthcoming, and what kind of impact they would have on Australia's economy and Australian workers?
Well, this is the interesting question, because there is a school of thought that says, well, if not with the Americans and we're to go this alone, we need some defence capacity. I mean, there is an argument whether you need a defence force at all. Let's make the assumption that we're in the parameters of actually having a defence policy, which then means that we need the hardware and other things. There is an argument to say that we should manufacture that in Australia. If we're going to use it, then we should make it. Okay, that is a fair, I think, conclusion to draw. But I think, as Doug will tell you, because he was involved, I know, at that time, there is a long history about an industrial approach in terms of workforce development and the industrial development in submarines, and in terms of the Royal Australian Navy and its needs. And what has upset, I think, many people, both current and former within the Navy, is that all of that work seems to have gone out the window with the promise of just doing something. So, well, we couldn't get our act together with conventional force, but somehow we're going to do it with a nuclear-powered one. And this is the bit that's disjointed. This is the bit that hasn't really been prosecuted as a case. There are all sorts of arguments, technical ones, which I'm not going to go into, not my area of expertise, but I do listen to people who are experts, and there is a growing view that even if it all worked, the time frame is such that it's highly likely that these big beasts will be transparent like a glass of water in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years in any event. And that's not coming from me. That's coming from experts in the field. So there is that. But the jobs, well, there's two aspects. One, if you're serious about jobs, do that as a strategy for an Australian Defence Force. You don't have to do that with nuclear submarines, and it's going to be easier the other way. Do a deal with the French or someone else who actually can commit to actually developing the Australian industry in a way that the Americans are just out there, essentially getting our money with no promises and no real timelines on these things. The second aspect is the opportunity cost. $360 billion. If what you wanted was a labour force strategy, a job creation strategy, I think we can do a lot better than this. We can do a lot better than this for the manufacturing workers, frankly, who do and may in the future make some of these things. Make Australian submarines, make the conventional ones, make the frigates, make all of the other things. It does not make sense to throw or commit $360 billion. And that is only one side. The other side of the opportunity cost is the jobs that you lose potentially in the ports that you base these submarines, and the opportunities that we may have, say, in Port Kembla, in terms of renewable energy, in terms of wind farms and other things that we can use, a hydrogen industry, our steel industry, our existing industries. Because, as we know, you can't have a US base, and that's what it'll be. It'll be a naval base with no exclusion zones. They'll take as much as they can. They'll have fighter jets. They'll have missile batteries. As a former US military person told me a couple of years ago, we don't leave these babies out there unprotected. So all of those things just raise huge questions as to why you would even think about going down this route.
Now, speaking of questions, there are a lot in the chat, and a lot of conversation happening in the chat. So I might actually start throwing straight to them, so we can get to as many of them as possible. Just because so many people have logged on, clearly there's so much interest in this issue. The most upvoted question so far that I'll pose to both of you is from Jock, and Jock asks, how can a defence arrangement decades ahead possibly anticipate the nature of the world at that stage? Could we be throwing an awful lot of money at something that at worst could make us a target in a nuclear war? So maybe I'll throw that one to you first, Doug, is AUKUS, are the timelines on AUKUS, the delivery timelines especially, just too long to anticipate what we'll need in the future?
Well, of course it is, but I just think the whole premise of AUKUS is wrong. I think people should have in mind what Henry Kissinger said. And what did he say? He said it may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal. And I just see that, we have got real problems going down the path that, that we are at the moment. We will not, we're going to get second-hand submarines if we ever get them, some of them. We're going to get a submarine that's being designed in the UK at the moment with no proven capacity. We're not sure if we'll get any of these things to come through. We're subsidizing jobs in the US. We're subsidizing jobs in the UK when we should actually be creating, in my view, a modular housing industry in Australia. We should be getting modular houses that can be the basis for a new housing commission in Australia, where people that will never own their home can actually get access to reasonably priced rental accommodation through a housing commission. These are the priorities, not some nonsense that we signed up because Morrison was stupid enough to sign a deal with AUKUS. We did this without proper analysis. There was no critical analysis of what we did. We signed off in 24 hours. That's not the Labour Party that I thought I belonged to, and certainly we need to do much better. So I just think the whole thing's wrong. I'm not really interested in nuclear submarines. I'm interested in making sure that we've got a good society in Australia, and a society that can look after those that are doing it tough, those that need help, not funding jobs in the US and UK in their failing, military industrial complexes.
Arthur, do you want to add anything?
No, I think I covered a lot of that in my earlier answer, and
sure.
I support what Doug said on that.
Yeah, and I might just jump in and add, because I haven't mentioned it already, that the Australia Institute is running a petition calling for the kind of scrutiny that Doug and Arthur have both discussed today, calling for a parliamentary inquiry into the AUKUS deal. So you can sign that on our website. I imagine many of you already have. If you have, maybe you could share it with a friend or a colleague who might also be inclined to share and sign and share and join the tens of thousands of Australians who have already signed. Our next question is a really interesting one for Rod, probably more directed at you, Doug. Rod asks, is the current Australian government really committed to AUKUS, or is it waiting and hoping that the states will pull out and give us an excuse to pull out without being blamed?
No, I don't think so. I think they're committed, and I just don't understand the reasoning behind that. I think there's a number of things that should happen. Simon Crean, when we went to Iraq, said that he would not commit Australia to any military activity unless there was no alternative. I've never heard anything like that come from the Labour leadership. I think they're going to get locked in to, conflict over Taiwan, which I take the view we should not engage in any war against China because of Taiwan. What it will lead to is a nuclear conflagration, and that is not in the interest of our country. So I just think we need to make sure we do that. We need to make sure, and we need to start arguing that before we send troops or engage in any conflict, there should be a proper debate in Parliament, because it's left to the executive now. And if the executive makes silly decisions like signing up to Aukus, how can they be trusted not to commit Australian troops in our country to war against our biggest trading partner on the basis that that we've got this commitment with America? It's stupidity of the utmost kind, and I can't understand why we ever got into this space.
Arthur, do you think that the Trump administration might give the government an out in that sense? You know, if there have been rumours, for example, that it might seek a pre-commitment to joining the United States in conflict. Do you think that would be a red line for the government?
Well, I'm concerned that it might be an in, to be quite honest. That's the real worry here. Look, a lot of people are dumbfounded by why we are continuing with this, because there is an obvious out. There are exit ramps wherever you look. I mean, the most obvious ones is that we are quite clearly dealing with a different world to when AUKUS was signed. Even within the parameters that the governments have set and the space that AUKUS operates in, we have the world's biggest power, the superpower, that has openly projects itself as unilateralist, not multilateralist, that its concerns for security are domestically based and driven, that it is not particularly interested in collective security. Well, that's a problem when you sign up on a deal that you're paying for that's supposed to deliver just that. And if that's not an exit ramp, what is? So it'll be very interesting to see how the Trump administration reforms this agreement and on what basis the government can possibly justify sticking with it. Look, I think it's quite simple in terms of the federal government. I think the power of particularly the Murdoch media and those forces are so strong now that the government believes that its options are limited, that it'll appear weak and to have somehow been defenceless or to have betrayed the national interest, whilst for most people who look at this objectively would say the opposite is true. There may well be, though, some caveats here because, well, we're assuming China's just going to sit on the sidelines. And as I constantly remind people, because we see it in our port, we've got some of the biggest corporations in the world operating out of ports. And our money comes from selling the Chinese the coal. As we say, the Chinese write our checks and Trump cashes them in, essentially. And there's already some movement on BHP at the moment. There's a bit of saber rattling from what I understand. Well, let's not assume the Chinese will sit by and not put any pressure of their own. Let me just briefly make another point here. The thing that we've missed in terms of security is our neck of the woods. We're in the Pacific here. If we're really concerned about the security of our region, then surely the worst thing you could do is to pick sides. The Indonesians, I know, are smart enough to still say we're non-aligned. They're not silly. They're basically saying to the Chinese and the Americans, we're not going to align. Well, that's a smart thing to do when you're in this part of the world and you're actually closer geographically to that Asia sort of Pacific end. That's where we are. Australia, I think, is very far from that position. I think the best we could hope for here from the Albanese government, I hope that they do it, is to have a red line on those essential questions around bases, because that'll be the tricky thing now. I think the Americans will say, well, we'll give you what we can when we can, but you've got to give us your bases as staging posts, no questions asked. That's going to be the battle line, I think, and that's why the campaigning on the ground is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question I've got here is from Steve, who notes that the media focus, and really, I mean, the focus of our conversation as well, has been on what Steve describes as submarine supply, but I think we can argue is really the pillar one of the AUKUS submarine deal. So there are two pillars. Pillar one is the submarine stuff, and pillar two is more around technological cooperation, technology sharing, that kind of thing. So Steve asks and points out that there are other elements of AUKUS around this access to technology and other assets under development. Are there any components of Pillar 2 and the potential value that they represent? Steve is asking, is there any added value to Australia in parts of the AUKUS deal and probably more Pillar 2? I'll throw it open to both of you.
I don't think so. I mean, AUKUS and the Forced Posture Agreement is simply about US hegemony. It's about them maintaining their economic and their military capabilities, and we are being, pulled into that. So I don't think there's anything that's in that agreement that's worthwhile doing. I did the Carmichael lecture the other week along with the Carmichael Institute and the Australia Institute. I put forward a number of points. I might just go through quickly some of them. That we should take urgent steps to identify alternatives to AUKUS and the Forced Posture Agreement. That we should give notice to the US and end the AUKUS agreement. That's my view. We should ensure that there's genuine parliamentary oversight of the defence and security intelligence services, because this is one of the big issues. When I was in Parliament, we had this crazy thing, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and they're the ones that are supposed to oversight, in other countries, what these security services are doing. And just put your mind back to what happened in Iraq, where there was nonsense coming out the security services and the intelligence services. In Australia, all that this committee does is oversight the budget of these organizations. They've got no capacity to do anything. So we could be getting fed absolute nonsense from the security and intelligence services. We wouldn't know, because Parliament has got no control over that. I think we have to legislate for parliamentary debate before any declaration of military engagement. We should establish and fund a national peace research institute in Australia, not these war institutes that we've got. And we should conduct a parliamentary inquiry into the implications of the revolving door of public servants, of former defence personnel and former MPs who are out there now advocating for AUKUS. They're on the payroll of the military industrial complexes. The ABC do not even ask them about any conflicts when they come and give us the advice. And I've used the word advice in inverted commas, that we should be, backing AUKUS and, Kim Beazley, we all know Kim. I like Kim Beazley, but he's military mad on this stuff, and we've got former politicians making squillions out of this, and it's not acceptable that they're allowed to go on our national broadcaster without indicating that they've got a vested interest in pushing us into AUKUS and an engagement with the US. So we need to do that. We need to conduct an inquiry into what's happening, and nobody from defence or Parliament or the bureaucracy should be able to go into these companies under 5 years from being in Parliament.
Thanks, Doug. And if anybody is interested in listening to Doug's full lecture, it's actually available as both a video recording on our website and also a podcast episode. So you can access all of that through the Australia Institute's website. And I highly recommend. I was there in person, and it's a cracker. I've got a question now here from Annie. It's one we didn't really address in our conversation. Maybe I can throw it to you, Arthur. Annie asks if it's possible to address the issue of nuclear waste and that part of the Aukus deal?
Well, and there's two aspects. One is nuclear waste, because there are very specific references to accepting that waste, though it is unclear the terms on which that would actually operate, because once again, we have a mountain of secrecy surrounding that deal. Look, nuclear waste is one of those issues that hasn't been resolved by the major nuclear powers since the onset of the nuclear age. To once again forward to project here that we are going to somehow deal with this in the anticipation that we will, in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 or 50 years, come up with the solutions that the world's nuclear superpowers haven't in the last 80 years, I think is fanciful. And once again throws open questions as to, is it the usual answer to these things, and that is to lump our first Australians with those sorts of problems on their land and their traditional lands? Is that what we're going to do? What guarantees can they offer people who've been fighting these things since Maralinga and those days, really, with a nuclear test, where there is a very, very long and awful history, frankly, around those issues. So, yes, the nuclear waste issue is a big one, but it also extends to nuclear proliferation. And, we keep on talking about nuclear in terms of these small little radioactive units, a bit like Energizer batteries in submarines. These are nuclear reactors in our harbours that they're talking about. And we remind people that if in Port Kembla, of course, we have the saying that if you're not going to let or allow nuclear submarines into New York Harbour, they're banned from New York Harbour. Why would we let them into Port Kembla? Why would we let them into Brisbane or Sydney or anywhere else? They're banned from those harbours for a reason, and that is because they're too dangerous, not just in terms of anything that can go wrong mechanically or otherwise with the submarine, but also because they are a terrorist threat. It's a potential terrorist target as well, let alone a nuclear target in a more strategic sense. So, yes, the nuclear question is a big one. And when you have schools and hospitals and other things so close to these ports, people would obviously ask the question, you're doing this for our security, don't bother, please, because you're making the world more dangerous, not more secure.
Mm. Yeah, really well said, Arthur. Doug, do you want to add anything about the nuclear issue?
Yeah, look, I think there's been three, I think they're called Class A issues at the Faslane base in Scotland from nuclear submarines over the last couple of years. Now, Class A are pretty serious issues where, where nuclear energy could be released. So I think there's a big problem there, and we'll get the Brits have had these nuclear submarines, and the Americans who've had them for decades now. They haven't solved the problem about how to get rid of the nuclear waste. And not only do the local communities become a target, but these submarines are sitting rotting in Scotland with bigger problems every year with these submarines because they've got no way of disposing of the nuclear energy. The French submarines are, I think they are not as highly enriched as the American submarines. So this highly enriched uranium, we'll have to deal with it if this ever goes through. And I don't think that has not been thought through, but nothing on AUKUS had been thought through anyway.
I think that's true, Doug. I mean, we've spoken a lot about the significant risks that AUKUS poses for Australia across a number of fronts, nuclear waste being just one of them. But there are a few questions in the chat about the risks of withdrawing. Doug, you mentioned your argument before that Australia should publicly withdraw from the AUKUS agreement. I mean, given who we're dealing with, given the the volatilities of President Trump, is there a significant risk to Australia, do you think, Doug, from doing that? What would be the potential backlash, I suppose?
I mean, Trump's unpredictable, but I don't think he would declare war on Australia. Um, I mean, of course, there's no risk. Uh, I mean, what people don't remember is that we've gone in with the US on every piece of warmongering that they've undertaken over the last, 50 years. Even the UK said no, they were not going to Vietnam. Why couldn't we have just said no? We don't want nuclear bombs located in Australia. And we should have just said absolutely not. And this argument that we don't have nuclear bases here, this Marl's argument that we've got forced rotation and we don't have bases, we're going to have bases here. And how do you ever get rid of those bases in the future? Given that, the US itself seems to be splitting apart domestically. They are totally unreliable. We've got their nuclear weapons based in Australia, and we've got politicians trying to tell us we've got no US bases. This is crazy crap from our government on these issues.
Arthur? Yeah, look, I'd agree with Doug obviously on that, but also to say that if we play this through in terms of scenarios, the notion that one of the most isolated countries in the world at the moment, which is the United States, at this point in time, if you were to look at the strategic situation, it doesn't take a general, I think, to work out that America is on the offensive position in a number of spheres of conflict, and that in the case of Australia's position, both our geographic and our political position in the world, it would be absolute madness to publicly provoke and to what they'd say would be forward deployment or forward defence. In other words, to try and pick a fight, not just with our biggest economic interest and trading partner, but one of the world's superpowers. We know that we can't win that one. What we don't know in the event of a conflict is if the United States would actually do anything. This is the real concern now, and that's why I said earlier that the world has changed since the Aukus agreement was struck. It was bad then. It's incomprehensible now because we don't even have the guarantee. We call it a protection racket here that we're paying them, but we're not even sure of the protection here. It leaves just a racket. We're just paying the money here to actually destroy relationships with one of the world's superpowers. And they're, I'm sure, scratching their heads going, why on earth would Australia be even thinking about doing this? It's not as if China has in any way indicated hostile intent here. I don't think we should be naive, though, that obviously there is a battle line here for spheres of influence, but you would think that the best way to deal with that is to actually secure our neck of the woods, which is the Pacific. And that's best done diplomatically, economically, along the questions of growth, not militarism, because we're not going to win with a military approach, and we aren't really sure where America will stand. No one is. Just ask the Ukraine and others. We don't really know. So it makes no sense. And, I think most people are justified in sort of saying that this is fear now. There is no plan B. This is such a radical change that people are too scared to make that leap. And I think that's where we are.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, Arthur. And I often say that, maybe one of the, perhaps very thin, but maybe one of the silver linings of the Trump administration is that it can prompt Australia and Australians to rethink security and to rethink what actually might make us safer. We are rapidly running out of time, and I just wanted to end on one question, because I think, we've had so many people sign up to this webinar, which I think demonstrates a real level of concern about not just Aukus, but about, all of the things that we've talked about Trump and the alliance. And there, I think, is a sense of, because this is foreign policy and it's bipartisan and it's often so far removed from democratic accountability and scrutiny, there's a sense of somewhat of a sense of powerlessness. And so I wanted to ask you both what you think people can do if they are worried about AUKUS, if they are worried about the alliance. I mentioned signing our petition, but of course there are other things. So what do you think people can do to make their concerns heard and to begin to shift Australian foreign policy? Doug, I might start with you.
Well, I think the first thing is that they should get, groups of people who are concerned about AUKUS to go and visit their local MP and get their MP to explain to them why they are backing this lunacy that could lead to a nuclear conflagration. Just go and talk to your local MP. If you're a member of the Labour Party, join Labour against war. If you are a member of the Greens or you're an independent, get them to start arguing strongly against this. The Greens are doing that, which is good. Just organise. See, in my old union, the Metal Workers Union, we had this argument that you organise, you educate, and you intervene. So you organize people around the issues, you educate them about the issues, and then you can intervene. So this is part of I think the Australia Institute is dead right here. This gets people to understand the issues, and we go out, we organize, we educate, and we intervene.
Thanks so much, Doug. Arthur?
Well, I agree with everything that Doug has just put forward. They're very key and important cornerstone principles for organising. Look, organising in your sphere of influence and your sphere of work. Obviously, for those in the labour movement, the trade union movement, within your own unions and labour councils, and working with your communities. This is not just something that you can, sort of pigeonhole into particular areas. We need to get this as a broader movement for those that are politically active, in whatever party you're in, or even if you're not in a party, to participate in the various groups, which there are several community-based organisations. Those that are in the Labor Party, of course, Labor Against War, I'd encourage people to participate in that and activate branches on this question. But more so than perhaps anything else is to not accept the parameters that some of the conservative forces have set up, the no-go zones, the red signs, more or less. We need to have a broad discussion here about Australian values, not just American values and our shared values and what's in the best interests of America. The Americans have told us very clearly they will do what's in their interests. And in terms of the politicians who say to us, shared values, I'm struggling to find a lot of those with the current administration that's built on lies, on unilateralism, on violence, and no respect for rules or constitutions within their own country, let alone anyone else's. They're discussions that are real that we have to have, I think.
I couldn't agree more, Arthur. Thank you so much for joining us with that beautiful sunrise behind you there in Crete. We appreciate it so much. Gosh, look at that.
It's going to be tough over the next week, but someone...
Thank you so much, Arthur, for getting up so early in the morning, and thank you, Doug, for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
It's really our pleasure. As I said, the recording of this webinar will be available on our website, and you can sign up for updates at australiainstitute.org.au. And if you want to read more about the rethinking, I guess, the nature of our relationship with the United States and those shared values that Arthur mentioned, I'll just give my little essay a plug. It's called After America, and it's part of the Australia Institute's Vantage Point series. You can buy that on our website or take out a subscription. And you can also subscribe to our podcast, which is also called After America and drops every Tuesday. But with that, thank you again, everybody, for joining us. I can see lots of warm reactions for both Doug and Arthur. So thank you both, and hopefully we can continue this conversation.
Yeah. Keep doing it tough, Arthur.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.